This is the Get Out the Virus panel. And what we mean by that is, how do you administer an election, increase turnout, and get the word out about get out the vote in the age of the coronavirus? With us today, we have a few experts from Colorado, in my opinion, and I think the opinion of many others on this panel, the premier state to vote in, especially during a global pandemic. First, I'd like to introduce Elena Nunez, Director of State Operations for Common Cause. I'd also like to introduce, you can wave, Elena. That's Elena. Oh, and I'm gonna ask each one of these panelists a question just to get us started and break the ice a little bit. Elena, can you tell us all how you got passionate about voting or civic engagement?
Yeah, so I had always sort of followed politics growing up. It was something that, we talked about in my family, I was interested in. But then for me, the big election was the 2000 presidential election. And on the night of election day, I was canvassing in Northern California, knocking on doors, talking to voters, really just talking to people about the environment. And at every door, people would give me an update on the election and who won and what was happening. And it became clear by the end of my shift, which was about 9 o'clock in California, that something had gone pretty dramatically wrong with how our elections were being run, and that there were already questions about whether people's votes were being counted, whether we know who the winner was. And of course, coming after that, there was a lot of talk about how we administer our elections. And from there, I've really just been, elections policy has been my passion. So yeah.
Thank you so much. Next up, I'd like to introduce Peg Pearl, the Director of Elections for Arapahoe County here in Colorado. Peg, how did you get passionate about voting or civic engagement?
Thanks, Ian. Hi, everybody. I would say it first started with Schoolhouse Rock in the 80s, because I'm a total nerd. And I know that was supposed to be the break in between the real Saturday morning cartoons, but I just wanted more of those. And so I ended up growing up in Arizona, fast forward going to law school and things, because I was really interested in how government could work with people and how people could work back and forth with government. And one of the things I learned when I was in law school was, no matter which topic I was really passionate about, whether it was at the time working against gender discrimination or environmental law or whatever the issue was that government was making policy on, it really mattered who was involved in those decision makings. And that would be who was the elected officials, and then also who voted and who had access to vote. And the fact that I was learning in law school that we have a whole lot of rights on paper that a lot of people walking around out there don't actually have real life access to. And so then I kind of went into this trajectory. I graduated from law school before the election of 2000. And so there wasn't even any classes about election law and campaign finance law so much. Now it's like a whole thing in law school. So I kind of charted this career myself, bouncing around in different government agencies at different levels and with nonprofits, really working at the access to voting, the access to campaign finance information, and ways to help people become more involved in a real participatory democracy.
Well, thanks a lot. We're lucky to have you. I'll now introduce Martha Tierney, elections super lawyer, principal at Tierney Lawrence Law Firm, who works for lots of progressive nonprofits as well as the Colorado Democratic Party. And Martha chairs the board of National Common Cause. Martha, how did you get involved in politics or elections or voting?
Thanks, Ian. I grew up in a very civically engaged family, and my the first campaign I worked on was George McGovern in 1972. I can remember walking my neighborhood in Duluth, Minnesota, dropping lit on people's porches, and it just was instilled in me from a very, very early age that voting is critically important and it's what you do. And before and after law school, just became really passionate about making this my primary focus in my career. And so here we are. Thanks, George McGovern.
Well, we're all grateful to George McGovern, and we're all lucky to have you fighting for us here in Colorado, Martha. And last but not least, Manny Lopez Del Rio, who is the Director of Public Engagement for the Colorado Secretary of State's Office Colorado Secretary of State is Jenna Griswold. Manny is also a former staffer at Progress Now Colorado, and he left us to go join the SOS office earlier this year. Manny, how'd you get passionate about voting?
Well, you know, first I'll say that I really do miss you guys over at Progress Now. And things
buddy.
are quite different, you know, over here on the government side. But you know, I think if I'm not mistaken, Martha, wasn't Gary Hart McGovern's campaign manager back in --
Yeah, well, I don't know if he was the manager, but maybe he was. He was, you know, one of the top dogs.
Yeah. Well, when I was in college, I originally wanted to be an economist, right? I just like loved the charts and how you could demonstrate that economics was not a study of money, but a study of human behavior, right? And how humans deal with choice and scarcity. By the time I got to Calculus 3, I was like, you know what, I've had it with this. And I started to realize that I was going to be in a basement crunching numbers and spreadsheets. And I got an email from a professor that said, hey, Manny, you know what, there's an opportunity to be an intern and still be a student in Washington, D.C. So I was interning for Harry Reid at the time in 2010. And, you know, I wore a suit to work every day, and I had my notes in my hand, and I would like run around the Capitol. And that to me was it was a mind-blowing experience. After 6 months, they kicked me out of being an intern, and I wouldn't leave. So they sent me down to Nevada to work on Harry Reid's re-election campaign. And in my mind, I thought I was going to be traversing the Nevada desert in a bulletproof SUV with the senator, right? And when I got there, they told me like, Manny, here's a list, here's a phone, make some phone calls, knock on some doors, right? And at first, it was just terrible because, you know, I felt cheated. But after you work in those communities for a little bit, you start to realize how impactful your work is. And, you know, like most of the time you're getting chased out of a neighborhood by very angry neighbors, you know, just running out of the neighborhood. But for every 10 of those doors that you knock, there's one door that you knock on in which they say to you, hey, you know what, if it wasn't for you, I probably wouldn't be casting a ballot. And that makes it all worth it, right? And ever since then, I just kind of stuck around and bounced from campaign to campaign. I've had the opportunity to be a public servant in the U.S. Senate in the city of Denver, and yeah, I actually also worked for IFE, which was they're the organization that organizes and oversees elections in Mexico, in their first ever program where Mexican nationals could vote from abroad, from here in the States. That was a wild adventure. So just all these experiences have really kind of reinforced for me my calling in life, right? And that is to be as helpful as I can in helping people be able to have a voice in the government that they want. You know, the last thing that I'll say is over the last couple of months, with a lot of this anger in the streets and anxiety and people really kind of realizing that we are mistreating people of color in their access. For me, you know, like, it's important to go out and protest. It's important to make our voices heard. But if we don't turn that corner and cast that ballot, things are not going to change. So my passion is really turning that anger, that frustration, and that grief into power at the voting box.
Amen. Thanks, Manny. Thanks, everybody. And I'm Ian Silveri. I'm the Executive Director of Progress Now Colorado. We're the state's largest multi-issue progressive advocacy organization. We do all sorts of fun stuff, and you can check us out at progressnowcolorado.org. Let's hop into the discussion, though. So in 2013, Colorado's legislature passed and the governor signed House Bill 1303, which was the universal mail ballot law. I think we called it COVAME, Colorado Voter Access and Modernization of Elections Act, right? Am I good? All right, awesome. And ever since then, Colorado has been a universal vote by mail state. So I want to start with Martha, because I know you had a lot to do with sort of the crafting of the policy itself. Can you talk a little bit about what the system was before 2013, and then what 1303 did?
Sure. So we've been evolving somewhat in Colorado towards more mail voting because we had what was called, well, it was a no excuse system, and it was called permanent vote by mail list. So you could put yourself on the list and then you would get a mail ballot each time. But we still had precinct-based in-person voting. We didn't have same-day registration, and Dropboxes were largely non-existent in the beginning. Even at at vote center or at precinct polling places. So then when we had passed 1303 in 2013, we really spent a lot of time thinking about what would be the best policy to modernize our elections entirely. And we knew we wanted same-day registration, and we knew we wanted to move toward more mail voting. But in order to do that, we really had to agree and come to consensus that moving away from precincts and into vote centers was the best way to go. Because we knew we didn't want to have only mail voting. We had to preserve in-person options for those folks that needed those options. And so it took a while to get to where we ultimately arrived at, but I think that what we did arrive at and what our laws are now in Colorado really are what I hope the rest of the country moves to. So same-day registration, every voter who's registered gets a ballot in the mail, but they have that option to vote in person if they want to, and they have many options to return it. They can put it in a Dropbox, they can mail it, or they can take it to a vote center or to their clerk's office. So I'll leave it there because I'm sure others have things to add.
Thanks, Martha. Elena, you're the Director of State Operations for Common Cause, so you look at the voting systems of all the states in the country and maybe other countries in the world as well. What sets Colorado apart? What are the good pieces of our system that other states should be adopting, especially things that they can do quickly right now to get ready for this November's totally crazy election?
Yeah, I think the thing that makes Colorado special is that it really is comprehensive. And just to emphasize what Martha said, before we passed the law in 2013, the coalition that came together, which was progressive civic engagement groups and election administrators at the county level, we had been fighting each other at the legislature every year where we'd try to pass something to improve registration reform and have same-day registration, and they'd try to pass all vote by mail, and we just kill each other's bills. So we started from a very antagonistic place, so it really took a lot. And I think what did it was we took a step back and said, what is the entire voting process, from how someone's able to register, how that registration is maintained, to how they're able to cast their ballot. And I think that's what makes Colorado a model. Knowing that we're now in August for a November election, I think, now is not the time. If you're a state that doesn't have those things, you're not going to go from 0 to 100 overnight. But I do think, the other piece of what Colorado does well is it gives voters options. And even now, if you're a state that has expanded vote by mail, allowing people to, for the first time, maybe request an absentee ballot or encouraging people to vote that absentee ballot, I think we really have to focus on how are people going to return those ballots. And there was already a question in the chat around Dropboxes. I know there's a lot of controversy in a lot of places, but giving voters the option to take that ballot to their polling place and have a place where they can drop it off and they'll actually accept it, which a lot of states don't do. And Colorado used to not. Like if you brought your mail ballot to a polling place in Colorado 15 years ago, they would turn you away, which is bananas, but that's true in a lot of places. So accepting ballots at every place where people are voting and having drop boxes throughout the community where someone who's buying their groceries can also return their mail ballot, or going to the library or taking their kid to an after school program. Like who knows what we'll be doing in November and how much we'll be getting out of our houses, but having drop boxes in the community, I think is probably the best thing at this point we can do to make sure that people are able to vote. And then in the long term, I think it's the registration and other pieces as well, so that the system really hangs together.
Thanks, Elena. Hey, Peg, as an actual elections administrator, someone who has to actually send those ballots out, get them back, count them all, and verify it, and what parts of the law have you seen that needed either improvement or changes over time? And what have we done to improve this system? Not like 1303 wasn't perfect when it was written, Martha. But obviously, like when you put something into effect, like you learn a lot about it. So can you talk a little bit about what we've learned and how an elections administrator actually deals with the law the way it is?
Sure. And I think one of the things is this topic that already is on the top of everyone's mind, which is Dropboxes, right? So when 1303 was first put into place as a law, and I was working for one of the nonprofits that was sort of part of the coalition in those discussions, Dropboxes were like, oh, this is a cool extra thing. It would be great if people did it. but it was not a requirement in the law. It wasn't a really big part of the law itself. And it was became sort of a best practices thing, where what happened is, different clerks would do some of them. They would talk to each other. There would be discussions. Did voters like it? They liked it. And it's evolved over time, so that then the most recent update to the law itself is now actually putting it in the law, specifically saying you have to have drop boxes and you have to have a certain number of them. But that was, a long process. And again, talking to states who are maybe just getting started, in Arapahoe County, we have about just shy of like 425,000 registered voters. 425,000 registered voters across the county, and we're just south of Denver for people who want to visualize it. So we, across the entire county, have drop boxes that are 24 hours. They are literally bolted into the ground. They have video equipment required. So this is part of the infrastructure that you have to put into place. They're under 24-hour surveillance. We keep those video requirements. These are all things that have sort of been tweaked over the years, but it keeps them safe. And then we do have basically like a ballot box that you can just put your ballot into, that sits on top of a table at these other vote centers when those are open. So in Arapahoe County, for our voters, we have between 32 and 34 of those 24-hour boxes in the ground by November. And we have an additional 12 vote centers that you could drop things off. So we're talking, 45 places that people could go drop off a ballot. That is something that evolved since the actual law was in place, into a best practice, and now it's more formally in the law. I think some of the other things, and we're really working on this still, since I came into this position, is how counties work together. So in Colorado, we have a model where counties are the main administrators of our elections. And I think, other than having statewide standards in 1303, which is really important, those counties a lot of times worked in individual silos. And worked with their voters. And we've done some changes finally to talk about, well, what can we do to work across counties? Martha and Elaine and I all know 4 years ago in 2016, there was a real problem at times with voters who went to vote centers on election day that was not in their right county. I don't know about other states out there, but we have some cities that cross county lines. So we have a big city of Aurora, which y'all might have heard about for other police issues, which is a whole nother panel, I know. But it crosses 3 county lines. So there are 3 county clerks who run and send ballots and run elections in the city of Aurora. And if you're just an Aurora voter, you have to show up at the right county location, even though maybe it's the rec center by your house or not, based on where those county lines exist, which we all know are not painted on the streets, right? You have to know in a map. So in 2016, if you showed up at the wrong place, you couldn't vote your whole ballot. You couldn't vote those things. And so we worked hard to then change the law to develop things, what we call now a statewide ballot. So 4 years later now, I, as one of the counties who administers it in Aurora, if someone walks into my vote center, but they actually are from Adams County, I have the choice to give them a statewide ballot where they can still vote for president, senator, all the statewide ballot measures, basically a whole host of things that don't change from county to county, and that will count. And if you don't have time to get and go to a different vote center, then that is a real substantive difference of someone who couldn't vote 4 years ago and can vote today. But it's only because the counties are breaking down our silos. Likewise, we are co-branding these drop boxes in a city like Aurora, so both county ballots can go in the same drop box. And behind the scenes, we transfer them. So I think those are some of the things we're working on in Colorado.
That's awesome. Thanks a lot. And Manny Lopez Del Rio from the Colorado Secretary of State's office, they're the statewide elections official in Colorado that works with all the county clerks and recorders to ensure that we have safe and secure elections here with our somewhat new but now tried and true mail ballot system. Have you been talking to other states? Have they been reaching out in the middle of COVID land, trying to figure out like what can they possibly do right now to ensure a high voter turnout, low effect of people not wanting to show up and vote in person for fear of, getting the virus or spreading it? Like, have you been in conversations with other clerks and recorders and secretaries of state from other states, and what are they asking you?
No, absolutely, absolutely. And we have bi-weekly calls with all the county clerks. That's how we coordinate and make sure that we are all on the same page and that we understand what's happening and that we're mitigating problems as we're encountering them, right? When I was joining the team, we weren't in quarantine yet. So I said to myself, well, cool, like I'm gonna join the office, and then we'll just ramp up and I'll learn kind of like what an SOS does. And my first week there, it was like the first week that they went remote. So we went from, running an election to running an election under a pandemic for the first time, in modern history. So that here in Colorado, I like to brag, and we are, if not the best, top 3 in the way that we conduct our elections. And everyone from the statewide elections team to the county clerks and the elections directors like Peg, who's amazing, by the way, have done an amazing job. I don't know if you guys realize this, but we pulled off one of the best elections in the country remotely at the Secretary of State's office and at the county clerk's office. So I think that speaks volumes to how amazing we are. I don't speak to other secretaries of state, but Secretary Griswold on a daily basis is in constant communication with secretaries of state like Alex Padilla in California, Jocelyn Benson in Michigan, Secretary Wyman in Washington State. And they're constantly exchanging information on what's working, what's not working. And it's not just particular to Democrats, right? Wyman is a Republican. In Ohio, Secretary LaRose is Republican. So there is this realization that under COVID, we do have to find another way other than just in person to cast a ballot, right? That being said, even though we prefer for people to vote with their mail ballot, we can't disenfranchise some voters that are not going to have an easy time casting a ballot that way. So we also want to preserve providing an in-person option. That being said, the secretary has been working with the county clerks to implement certain rules, right, to ensure the safety of the staff and voters. Sending them PPE, sending them gloves, sending them material so they can wipe down machines after every use. So there is constant communication with other secretaries of state, both Republican and Democrat across the country.
Thanks a lot, Manny. So let's move into like the conversation that's kind of at the top of everybody's minds. We've seen weird pictures around the internet of postal boxes being put onto trucks. We've read stories about mail sorters being decommissioned in certain parts of the country. And we've heard the President of the United States say pretty loudly and clearly that he doesn't want mail ballot voting to be the primary mode of voting this year because he fears that it will help him lose the election, which, just saying the quiet part out loud again. If states are moving into a mail ballot type election for the first time, or they're drastically increasing some kind of absentee voting system, Elena, we'll start with you. What dangers do states and elections officials face in like a fast and chaotic transition to remote voting? And what would you tell them that they need to start thinking about right now in order to get it right, so that in November, when the election comes down, God forbid it's even close, the president doesn't have a leg to stand on if he tries to delegitimize the results?
Yeah, and I mean, that is the question, right? And I think that a couple of things. First, because Colorado has done such a good job, thanks to the work of Peg and Manny and so many who administer our elections, it looks easy to send out millions of ballots, get them back, and count them accurately, when it's really a very sophisticated process. And Peg can talk more about it, but even if we didn't have a threat from a president who's trying to destabilize one of, the core institutions of our country, it requires a lot of work. And it would have been a huge lift for states that are expanding anyway to make sure that ballots are printed properly, that the right ballot goes to the right voter, it gets there in time, the voter understands how to complete the ballot. fill out whatever they have to do to make sure their ballot is accepted, and then to count it. So we were already looking at a major task before the USPS piece came in. And so I think it's worth just emphasizing states need to continue to focus on all of those pieces, because we've seen from the primary in a lot of states, even though there was great use of vote by mail, which is, I think, a good thing and really the only thing we could do during the pandemic, we have a lot of education to do for voters about how to make sure your ballot gets accepted. And some states where it was new, we saw a lot of ballots rejected because voters didn't know that they had to sign the back of the envelope, or they didn't know that if they didn't fill it out just, a certain way, their ballot wouldn't be accepted. And one of the big fights right now is what happens when that happens. And in some states, we do a good job of saying, hey, voter, we got your ballot, you didn't complete it, we need you to fill out a little more paperwork so we can count it and accept it. In other states, we don't do that, and that's being litigated as we speak. Or the timeline to do it is so short that by the time the voter knows there's a problem, it's too late to fix it. So that is a problem as well. And I think for those of us who are not election administrators, but who are talking to voters and doing civic engagement work, we can't underestimate the importance of voter education about how to participate in the new system. And then to the other question, which is this looming threat, I think there's a few things. I mean, one, I think we've seen tremendous outcry from a lot of local officials on both sides of the aisle. It may be partisan in Washington, D.C., but in a lot of states it's not, because leaders know that it is because of the U.S. Postal Service, not only that people get their ballots, but that people get their prescription drugs, or they get, the important, pieces of mail that keep them in contact with their community. It's how they get all sorts of really important things. And so if you cut off that lifeline, it really is much more profound than just being a partisan attempt to limit voting. It's much bigger than that. So I think we need to push back. And I think, if you have senators who haven't come out and said that they're going to fight like hell to preserve the Postal Service, they should hear from you. And I think we need to do everything we can to not let the destabilization of the Postal Service keep us from being able to vote. So if you want to vote by mail, request that ballot early. Once you get it, return it early. If you have the option to drop it off, do it that way instead of relying on the mail. Anything we can do to sort of mitigate what we know is coming, I think is important. But I also think that we're really, we're in flux. So I'd say it's both. We have to both fight to protect the institution and look for as many ways to make sure that our votes still count, whether that's voting early or voting by mail, but dropping your ballot off as possible.
Yeah, I mean, who thought in 2020 we'd be spending all of our time defending the mail? Kind of figured that was just a built-in feature of the old country, but now we got to fight for that one too. So, I mean, when I got my primary ballot in Colorado, I walked it 3 blocks with my dog down the street and dropped it off at the steel reinforced concrete bolted down. There's no way anyone's going to mess with this humongous tank of a box drop box. And I felt like this was amazing. I didn't have to touch anything. It was like, the pandemic has never, unfortunately, left this country. It's just kind of going up and down, but it was on a little bit of an uptick, and I could just slide it into a slot and walk back home. And the whole thing took me about 15, 20 minutes. That, besides actually filling out the ballot, which in Colorado can be quite an adventure. This year, it looks like it might be 2 pages. But Peg, can you talk a little bit about, what can be done? Let's say, worst case scenario, the president and his political allies are successful in crunching the ability of the post office to actually process mail. What can clerks do in a state like Colorado and other states, if applicable, to fight back against that and or make the mail balloting system work better for people so that we can try our best to ensure that every ballot that's cast is counted?
So, Ian, I never thought I'd say I'm glad that the pandemic and a postal service crisis happened at the same time, but this is the one reason I am. And this is because in June, when we were just dealing with the pandemic, we did have to be creative about just what you're saying. How can our voters engage? How can they get a ballot from us? And how can they return it to us or vote in person if they need to, while staying healthy? And so in places like Arapahoe County, we came up with brand new services, also not written in the law. But for example, curbside ballot pickup. So if you don't get your ballot, you could call and get a new ballot sent to you in the mail up 8 days before the election. Now then that cuts off by law. So what we did, because of just the pandemic and social distancing, during those 8 days, you could call up, and just like you're ordering your Chinese food, you order your ballot. We go through all the identity check and information with you. You pull up into the parking lot where we had a special sign set up, literally just tweaking a curbside ballot or a curbside pickup like restaurant sign. And we just put a little voting sign on the takeout bag of the graphic and put those marked parking in the parking lot of our office, and a ballot would come out to you. We would check your ID, make sure it's the right person, and give them the ballot. You could then vote the ballot in your car, put it in a 24-hour Dropbox, take it home, whatever. That was because of the pandemic, right? So that you didn't have to come into a vote center. We didn't have to have that interaction. Well, now that we're looking at the post office, possibly again, people not getting their ballot in the mail because of mail problems, we are actually expanding that service for November. So in November, we're going to offer that service for 15 days. So backing it up even farther in up to October at 5 different places in the county where you can call and get a ballot. So you need to kind of come up with those ways that you can work around a postal service problem, both in the delivery and in the return back. The other thing, in places like Colorado or even other states who have early voting, where your vote centers are open before Election Day, I am on a personal mission to never use the phrase early voting in anything in writing, because I'm also someone who's busy and I do things at the last minute. So if you tell me I'm early, I'm coming in 2 days because I don't have time to do things early. So in-person voting in Colorado starts October 19th. It's not early, you're late to the party if you show up on the 20th. Like, we're already moving. So for people who are trying to be helpful, this week I've already seen all across the internet people saying, the people aren't gonna have their mail ballots. We need to drive them to the polls on November 3rd. No, please. Please drive them to the polls on October 30th or on October 31st or whatever in your state are other days, because the pandemic and COVID concerns, we don't want everybody coming on election day. If you have that option to get people in and out of vote centers earlier, you need to use that option as a way to work around postal delays. So those are the types of things that I think both the clerks and administrators, but also people running those GOTV really need to think about. Do not concentrate your GOTV on Tuesday because of the pandemic part. We gotta back it up. We gotta think about those other days to keep everybody healthy.
Thanks, Peg. Yeah, one of the things that we saw, an elections innovation, I think that was a very Colorado innovation. I forget what county it was, but they had a ballot drop-off by horse going on in a rural part of the state. So it's a very flexible system that can be used in any county throughout the state, depending on how people like to travel. Hey, Manny, from the Colorado Secretary of State's office, wondering the same question for you from a statewide perspective, looking down at the 64 counties and all the differences in the election systems, but having a uniform system to make sure everybody can vote. What can be done between now and Election Day to, in case, you know, God forbid, they're successful in screwing with the post office, to make sure that every ballot that wants to be counted or cast is counted?
Absolutely. So I think this goes to what Elena said, and I think this is getting information out there as much as possible. The secretary underwent a massive public information effort, and I kind of felt bad for the comms team, because for months and weeks they were just overwhelmed with all the work that they had to do. So we did a large ad buy, and we started putting a lot of information out there for voters. Also, you know, at the national level, the secretary has gone out there and she spread the word about how voting works in Colorado and how the president is wrong in his claims, right? And I think at this point, the president is just throwing noodles at the wall to see what sticks, right? He first started with, oh, well, it's vote by mail is rampant with fraud, right? And then there was a bunch of evidence that countered that. So we had to get that information out there. You know, what he's trying to do is he's trying to put doubt into people's minds. and to lessen the faith that we have in our institutions, in our elections. Another big thing that I think is happening is that there's a lot of misinformation and disinformation out there. So our office is making sure that we can counter that. Now, our office is not going to get involved in the whole political back and forth about what's true, what's not. Like, hey, like this guy has like a secret that he's not revealing. We're not going to mess with that. But what we are going to deal with is with attacks on the process. So if there's something out there, somebody that's saying, hey, you know what, precinct 743, the voting location there is shutting down. We need to be able to identify that, and we need to be able to respond to that immediately. So we're taking that pretty seriously. And what the secretary has done is that she's brought in a Department of Homeland Security undersecretary. And that person's sole job is to put together a program that is going to identify these threats, and that we'll be able to respond accordingly, so that that misinformation can be corrected immediately. Other than that, you know, we're also, the reason why I'm at the Secretary of State's office is because we're also embarking on a humongous outreach project statewide, right? That includes outreach to communities of color. I've been talking to ministers and to faith leaders, and I've been talking to Hispanic community thought leaders. We're going to be taking a trip down to the tribal lands to speak to the Mountain Utes and the Southern Utes to make sure that they have access to the ballot. So really communicating as much as possible with every single community out there in any part of the state. So communication is going to be key in dispelling a lot of the misinformation that's coming either from the president or from foreign actors or people just looking to do harm.
Thanks, Manny. And that's a great transition to my next question for Martha, which is, Martha, what are some of the biggest myths about mail balloting and mail voting that either the president or his allies have been putting out there into the world? And can you just knock a few of those down real quick and tell folks in the attendance, like why it's just not true that, you know, some of these claims the president have made are just kind of outlandish and have no relationship to reality and how we actually vote by mail in Colorado?
Sure. So some of the things you hear from coming out of the Trump White House or his allies are that, you know, vote by mail is ripe for rampant fraud. Well, it's just not the case. In Colorado and in states that operate vote by mail systems, voters receive a ballot. Voters who are registered receive a ballot several weeks before the election. And when they vote that ballot and return it, they, if they haven't voted by mail before, they have to include a copy of an ID so that they're verified as a registered voter, and they have to sign the back of the envelope, and that signature is verified when the ballot comes back. And if there's a mismatch on the signature, or if the signature is missing, or if the person was supposed to include a copy of an ID and didn't, there's a cure process where voters are contacted. They have 8 days to provide some additional information and to cure that ballot. So the system, the notion that somebody could go around and collect all sorts of ballots out of mailboxes and return them is just absurd. And doesn't happen and can't happen. So it's really unfortunate that the Trump White House is spreading those lies and so disingenuous that Trump himself votes by mail from a fake address, by the way, because he doesn't live.
Oh, cool. It's good. What's good enough for him, of course, isn't good enough for the rest of the country. And I think everybody should just see through that. Voting by mail is safe and effective, and we should all do it. And it leads to Colorado having some of, if not the highest turnout in the entire country, especially among young people. In the most recent primary, I think we had the highest turnout of under 35-year-old voters in the entire country. And in 2018, Colorado was the second highest turnout state in the union, I think behind Minnesota. Well, good job. We're coming for you this year. Elena, are there any myths that you'd like to dispel about the way mail balloting works in Colorado, or that other states and folks who work in elections in other states can use to push back against some of this misinformation?
Yeah, I mean, I think the one Martha mentioned is certainly the one we hear the most. I think the other one that I saw recently was that foreign actors were going to be able to create fake ballots and just stuff the ballot box with these fake ballots. And again, I think, Peg can tell in detail, and there's actually some great videos on the Arapahoe County website as well about how ballots are processed. But, I can't just go and photocopy my ballot and send them in. I mean, I can, but they're going to know that that's not a real ballot and they're not going to get counted. So I think the idea that this system is so, easy to manipulate, it's just not true. The other one we hear sometimes is that mail ballots don't get counted unless it's close, or they only get counted if they get around to it, or they only get counted if they're like done with election day, or like all sorts of other weird myths. And again, that's not true. In Colorado, which does it well, we start counting, before election day, and, none of the tabulated, we don't know, what the outcome is, but just to process them so that we have results. But if you vote by mail, it's the same in terms of the, validity of the vote as if you voted in person. And I think there's just a lot of confusion, especially in places where, people aren't as familiar with vote by mail. The president's counting on that and just trying to stir up confusion about, how easy it is to cheat, or that somehow your vote won't count. And that's just not true.
Thanks, Elena. Hey, Peg, can you walk us through like the life of a ballot, from when it gets printed and put in envelopes, when it gets to the voter, to when it gets back and gets counted? Can you just walk us through that system to prove to folks how many checks and verification steps there are in that whole process?
Sure. And as Elena said, we do have videos that we have put together. We've kind of a general animated type of video. And also during the June primary, I did a Facebook Live walk through the warehouse while things were actually being processed. So both of those videos are available on our Facebook page, which we are happy to have people share to other states just to really see what the process looks like. So it's Arapahoe Clerk and Recorder, our Facebook page, and our Twitter. You can find everything off our website, which is arapahoevotes.com. But basically what's going to happen is the ballot, first of all, it's very personalized in terms of what she was saying. Everybody's ballot and envelope has barcodes, and not on there isn't a name on the ballot, but the envelope has your name printed on it. So you can't just stick it in any old envelope with a photocopied ballot and turn it in. Like, that's not going to work. It's very personalized. And you can have, so those go out to people very individually. And then when they come back, the main thing about our process that also I think helps dispel myths is every stage in our ballot processing process is done with bipartisan judges. So the reason I need 450 election judges, and I'm not going to let us get to the end of this process of this panel without asking for people to sign up to be election judges. But I need 450 of them because every step is going to have a Democrat and a Republican, or a Green Party and a Republican, or something together as a check of accountability. So those ballots come back, they get scanned through a ballot receiving machine, and the first step is a very rigorous signature verification process. And it's actually 2 tiers, where it goes through a first tier of signature verification, and if the judge thinks that it's not a signature, or if the signature is missing, it goes to a second tier, which is again these bipartisan teams who have to agree. And the bipartisan team agrees whether or not the signature is a match before it can move forward. And then again, it gets sorted through. And when it goes through the ballot receiving machine, this is important for folks, it gets scanned, the barcode gets scanned into our statewide voter registration system. And the reason that's important is because it means Elena's ballot has already been turned in. And so on Thursday, Elena can't walk into a vote center and also vote in person, because if they pull her record up in the vote center on Thursday, they'll say, you know what, you already cast your mail ballot. So these infrastructures and systems are really important. And that's another check on fraud, that people could vote twice, right? That they could do the mail ballot or absentee ballot and also vote in person. Once it goes through the signature verification process, again, we have bipartisan teams who are in charge of opening those ballots, making sure that everything is okay and marked in there. We move the ballots away from the envelopes so that you have voter anonymity through the process. When you get to the point where you're counting, there is no way to say we're not counting ballots from a certain part of the city, or we're not counting ballots from Democrats or Republicans. Like, they're just pieces of paper that have no identity attached. And so they move through that bipartisan team into the tabulation room where they get scanned in. And that computer system, again, we have a bipartisan team who will look at any ballot that has any stray mark on it where there could possibly be a question about the voter intent. If they made a mistake or if they changed their mind, whatever. It's a bipartisan team who agrees on which vote should count. And that goes through the adjudication, that's called adjudication, goes through that process before, again, it goes into those tallies at the end. And then in Colorado on the back end, we're also doing a risk limiting audit after every election, which also is full of bipartisan folks involved. We're doing testing, logic and accuracy testing on these beforehand. We're keeping all these pieces of paper for 25 months, so we have a paper trail. These are all the pieces of accountability that happen and stick with the elections so that you can have faith in the process. Long story I'm not going to go into, but in a prior life, not that long ago, I was a candidate and I lost an election by less than 400 votes out of 150,000 cast, but I did not for a minute feel like the process was flawed or that I got gypped. Because there are just so many of these things along the way, and there's too many people involved in terms of bipartisan teams to be able to say that it could be manipulated for partisan purposes and only counting Democratic vote by mail ballots and throwing away the Republicans.
Yeah, it's pretty scary, and we're having this panel at Netroots Nation. We're talking to the audience here. It'll be recorded for other folks to watch this in the future. That's all great. Manny, I know that the Secretary of State in Colorado went on a pretty extensive tour, and I saw she did some media just yesterday, I think CNN or some national news. What can progressives do to get the word out and push back against the disinformation that's coming from the White House and other allies of the president who want to try and sow doubt and confusion about the system so that when they lose in November, they can have an argument to, I don't know, not leave? What can we do to push back against the misinformation and disinformation?
Well, I definitely want to thank Peg because she did a fantastic job of really going from end to end in all the measures that both the state and the counties take in order to make sure that we have credible, safe, and secure elections. I think the best thing is to make sure that your sources of information are accurate. Like kind of going back to what I was saying about the misinformation and disinformation. The best source is your county clerk. The best source is the Secretary of State's office, right? So if you have any questions, if you have any concerns, those are the best resources for the most accurate and up-to-date information. It's unfortunate that social media has just kind of spun out of control in some senses, but it's dangerous, right? Because all those algorithms and all that stuff on the back end, it's not always, the information that you get might not always be accurate, right? And think twice about reposting that scandalous article that you saw that says, hey, you know what, like they are doing X and they're doing Z. Make sure that your sources of information are credible. I think that is the absolute best way to prevent you from getting caught in spreading that misinformation and really hurting the institutions. So yeah, again, making sure that your best source of information is the state and your county clerk's office.
Thanks so much, Manny. We have about 10 minutes left, so if anybody from the audience has questions, please do pop them in the Q&A section. At the bottom of your Zoom window, you can click and you'll see the letters Q&A. You can put those questions in there if you have any. One thing I wanted to talk about is voter registration. Now that we're just a couple months away from the most important election of our lives, everyone is, but this one really, really especially is. What does Colorado do right? What can we be doing better? And what can other states do about voter registration? I mean, it used to be the parties would take a lot of control over this. Then came civic engagement groups. They were doing a lot of it. In Colorado recently passed a automatic voter registration bill, so that if you kind of move here or interact with any of several state agencies, bam, you are registered to vote on the file. They send you a postcard if you want to pick a party. But other than that, like, we have that. So let's start with Elena on this one. Voter registration in Colorado and elsewhere. What do we do right? What can we do better? And what can we learn from other states if they're doing it better than we are?
Yeah, I mean, I think Colorado's pretty much leading the pack. I think same-day registration is, if I had a magic wand, the single most important reform. And particularly, I think during not only the pandemic, but knowing that, you know, our country is also in economic collapse and a lot of people are now facing housing instability, may not be living where they were registered to vote. Being able to update your voter registration through Election Day is so important, because there may be voters who don't realize that their registration isn't current until Election Day when they go to vote, and it turns out that when they moved 3 months ago, they didn't update it. So I think, you know, same-day registration is a critically important reform. I also think automatic voter registration is important, because we may update our driver's licenses, we may do a change of address with the Postal Service. There's a lot of other ways that we fill out paperwork to keep our information current, and being able to use that to make the process as simple as possible. So, you know, once you've done it once, your registration follows you. That's also really important. So I think, you know, that's really the biggest thing. And if you are in a state that doesn't have those reforms, I think, and even if you are, checking your registration now, and even if you got a ballot for the primary, even if you have lived at the same house for 20 years, log on, confirm that your voter registration is accurate, so that if you are getting a mail ballot, you know it's coming to the right place. If you're not registered, you can fix it while there's still time. And if you are going to vote in person, you know where you can go. But making sure that your registration is accurate, I think, is the most important thing. And I do think, as we look at other states for lessons, the more we can expand automatic voter registration to other agencies, I think that's where there's real opportunity. Again, just to make it convenient, so that you don't have to update your registration at the DMV and then you update your registration over here and there and whatever. Anytime you interact with government and we know it's you, we can say, okay, great, based on this, we're going to update your voter registration as well. So I think, you know, that combination is really just the key to make it as convenient as possible. And for states that don't have online voter registration or don't have online vote by mail ballot requests, like, that's also something that, you know, a lot of states have been doing for a long time, but is long overdue.
Martha, any comment on voter registration, what we do well, what we don't do so well, and whether the states can learn from us or vice versa?
Yeah, I mean, I think Elena hit a lot of the high points there. I think having clean voter registration rolls is really important to conducting good elections. And so, you know, having those different ways for voters to keep their registration current is really critical. And so, you know, to Manny's point about communications to voters, you know, that's the single most important thing a voter can do right now, is go ensure that their registration record is accurate. Because if your registration record is accurate, in Colorado, for example, your mail ballots will start going out, you know, 3 weeks before November 3rd, or three and a half weeks before November 3rd. And so hopefully that even with some crazy stuff going on with the Postal Service, that's going to be enough to get those ballots in voters' hands, and then they can drop them off rather than put them back in the mail stream. To ensure that all votes get counted. But clean rolls and making sure there are ways for voters to assist with making those rolls clean is important, because the more opportunities for voters to ensure that their record is accurate, the better voter registration works.
Thanks. Peg, we only have 5 minutes left, so we're just going to do one more question, and then we'll do a little quick lightning round and get out of here. We often talk about how voting is a right and a civic duty, but when it comes down to it, safe and secure voting really is just kind of like a customer transaction process. How can election administrators get that part right?
So I think what you need to do is keep in mind that what is the end goal? The end goal is that anybody who wants to vote and is eligible to vote votes. And right now I have an asterisk, which also means votes in a way that they don't catch a, virus, right? So in general, if that is your end goal in mind, it's not just how do I not get yelled at or that kind of customer service. It's really about that. So that's where you have to be able to sometimes think outside the box. But I think what's most important is if our state laws are so restricted that the local election administrators don't have options to do things like start counting the ballots or processing ballots before election day, like, being able to help a voter who didn't get their ballot in the mail and give them a new ballot, then they can't do that kind of customer service where the end goal is getting anyone who is eligible who wants to vote to be able to vote. And that's where, sometimes you feel like your hands are tied, but keeping that ultimate goal in mind is basically, I think, what's important. Also, not just laws, but obviously it takes money. So funding, got to put that out there too, to be able to do all of that. But I think voters themselves want to be able to vote. That's just what they want to do. And so reassuring that and telling them all the information, don't hold back and think they're too stupid to understand, because they will understand, and the transparency is key. That's why we do all those videos. And then they know the process that you're trying to help them get through.
Well, thanks, Peg. Let's just run around the horn real quick. 30-second closing statement, just prompt question like, what can we do right now to make sure that the most number of eligible voters' ballots are counted heading into November? Manny, we'll start with you.
Yeah, I think it's important to make sure that people are registered to vote. Here in Colorado, if you are not registered, you can update your voter registration by going to govotecolorado.com. And there's going to be some family members out there that might not be civically engaged, and there's no better thing that you can do to encourage your uncles, your family, your friends to get registered. I think now more than ever in these times of civil unrest and uncertainty, this is how we change things, right? We can protest all we want, and I think that the protests were great, but we need to turn the corner again and turn that power in the streets to power at the ballot box. And that's the only way, the only true way in which we'll ensure change. As an activist, really quickly, in 2012, it was really hard for me to get people engaged on the West Side. But then in 2017, there was this surge of passion for really creating a change. And we were out in the streets and we were protesting. And thank God that we turned that corner. And now you see these people that were out in the streets protesting, and they're knocking doors. They're making phone calls. They're doing everything they possibly can to have an impact. And they're turning that power in the streets to power the ballot box. And that's how you create change. Register to vote. Get those people that you love registered as well.
Elena, 10 seconds, quick closing statement.
Be a poll worker or election judge if you can, and help make sure the elections go well.
Peg?
Yes, and let your employees be an election judge like jury duty. Give them the day off to do it.
Martha, final words?
Encourage all your friends and family to vote and show them what it takes to get registered.
Thanks to our great panelists. Thanks to everyone who joined us. We really appreciate you joining. Go register, go vote, be a poll worker, be a voter, go fight, win. Thanks, everybody.